Welcome. So the title of this class is The Sheik. Perhaps in more detail, Sinai and world peace. So as we're reading this week's Torah chapter, something just simply jumped out at me because there's different ways they translate Kohen Midian. Let me just explain. We're now in the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the 5 books of the Torah. And in the book of Exodus, each chapter, we're in fourth chapter, fifth chapter. The 5th chapter of the book of Exodus, which is the chronology of history, is essentially taking place exactly 40 days from when the Jews, 40 days, 7 weeks from when they left Egypt. So we know the book of Exodus is, of course, the long story of the ordeal and the oppression of the Jewish people in the first documented, institutionalized enslavement of a people. And after 210 years of suffering, they leave Egypt. And they begin their journey first through the Red Sea, and then finally reaching Mount Sinai in the Sinai wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And Mount Sinai, of course, the most monumental event in history, the revelation at Sinai, what we refer to Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And why I say it's monumental, not just for the Jewish people, because this is the book which remains the number one bestseller in all of history, even till this day. It beats all the top-selling books on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm not sure how the Times justifies exactly not documenting that, but it remains, the Bible remains the biggest-selling book, continues to be so thousands of years later. And frankly, most of the buyers are not even Jewish. That's even more interesting, because as we know, the Bible became the book that not only, of course, for the Jews, it was our blueprint and our guide to life, as we say, Chayenu v'Arich Yameinu, our life and our sustenance. But it also became the inspiration for the 2 major religions called Christianity and Islam, each in their time. Christianity around 2,000 years ago, and Islam around 1,300 years ago. And they became the basis of their system. And basically 4 billion people, if you say 2.8 billion Christians, maybe 2.5 billion Christians, 1.8 billion Muslims, billion I should say. So it's more than half the planet. And many also will say this, many of the Far Eastern disciplines were also influenced by biblical ideas and thoughts, of course, Abrahamic teachings as well. So it's not a small event when you talk about Sinai, once you know that it's affected so many people and continues to affect. Because when you look at most of the Western democratic constitutions, starting with the United States' Declaration of Independence and Constitution, it is based on the principles, basically Torah principles. Concepts that are biblical in nature. There are quite a number of books that have documented that. It's a great book if you're ever interested in this topic. It's called On Two Wings by Michael Novak, a scholar, not Jewish, but he writes a book. Really, it's essentially a collection of correspondence, a documentation of the founding fathers' shaping influences. And he makes the case, a very persuasive case in actual real physical documentation, not just speculation, that the principles of this country, the United States, which really became the principles of most Western countries today, or even not Western, any free societies, is what he calls Torah metaphysics. Not even Bible, Torah metaphysics. Read it in the words of John Adams, in the words of Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Paine and all the founding fathers, each of them in their own way. You see the influence of biblical thinking. And of course, you may be familiar with the fact that Hebrew was actually a consideration for becoming the language, the national language, because they saw this as the new Israel, they actually compared it to the Exodus from Egypt. And there are hints to it both on the currency and the dollar bill, as well as I said, in the documentation, they saw it as the new Israel. They saw it as like the Temple Mount, and this country manifests destiny, God's choosing it as the promised land to become a haven for human beings, etc., etc. So So in fact, Sinai, in other words, basically impacting the modern world much more than we even know. And it all begins in this week's chapter because that's where it documented the story of Sinai. The coming to the mountain, the preparations, and finally the receiving of the Ten Commandments. Which actually, I've always wondered whether the Ten Commandments is an accurate description, because actually Aseres Hadibris doesn't mean commandments. Aseres Hadibris means 10 expressions, or 10 utterances, dibur. So we say Asara Maimoris, we say 10 utterances with which God created the world. In the beginning of Genesis, so when you count them all, there's 10 different times God says, Vayomer Elokim. And Bereshis Nami Maimer, so Bereshis is also considered one. So that's one Bereshis, another 9. And then the 10 Commandments really would be Dibris, is not a commandment, would be Tzivuyim. The truth is, Tzivuyim could also be translated as Mitzvah says. Connections. So commandments is not necessarily an accurate translation, just for the record. But as many things in modern culture, they became popular, not necessarily true. And of course, once Cecil B. DeMille made a film called The Ten Commandments, that's it. That's etched in stone forever, no pun intended. That becomes it. Just like, of course, the Adam's apple. When we say Adam's apple, and the apple, the forbidden fruit, there's no opinion in Jewish thought that the tree of knowledge was an apple, just for the record. There are 4 opinions. Some say grapes, figs, wheat, grain, and esrog. Those are the 4 opinions. But apple is not one of them. I've discussed this a number of times where that myth came from. And it's usually the same thing also with, for example, Michelangelo's image of, since we're talking about all the, let's call it, what do they call them? What do they call them? The flukes? Not the flukes on TV, the bloopers, right? Something like that. So another blooper is the one when he makes Karnei Hoid Moshe, and he makes a picture, depicts Moses with 2 horns. Because in Hebrew, the word Karnei Hoid, Karen can mean horn, but Karen can also mean ray of light. And Moses' face was glowing, and when you don't interpret it correctly, it can be interpreted as horns, which is maybe where the concept came that Jews have horns. And there are actually many people who never met a Jew, they think Jews have actually horns, physical horns. Okay, but that's all a tangential trivia, we'll call it trivia. To go back to the theme, so we have here one of the most historical, the most historical event in history, that the monumental event of Sinai, this week's chapter. So the interesting thing is, however, it doesn't just begin with the revelation at Sinai. It begins by Yishma Yisrael. The beginning of the Torah says that Yisrael heard. It talks about Yisrael hearing what's happened and comes to see his son-in-law. Moses was his son-in-law. And because it's Yisrael is right in the beginning of the chapter, the whole chapter is called Yisrael. In English, they translate it as Jethro, but in Hebrew, it's Yisrael, and which seems somewhat bizarre that a chapter with such an important event should be named after a sheik. Sheik, how do we pronounce it? Sheik. A Midianite. He was not Jewish. He wasn't. Later he converts. Different opinions what that meant exactly, but bottom line is, he was Moses' father-in-law, because in Midian, when Moses escapes from Pharaoh, who wanted to kill him, he runs to Midian. Midian, just for the record, is the modern-day southwestern side of Saudi Arabia. So Midian would be that peninsula, which is like on the right side of the Red Sea. That's where Midian more or less is. And Kohen Midian, Yisrael, is the Kohen of Midian, and Kohen is translated sometimes you can say as a minister, sometimes you can say as a priest, but also Sheik is translated. So as soon as you open the chapter and you read Sheik of Midian is the beginning of this chapter, and this precedes Sinai, immediately, for myself at least, jumped out at me. Look what's going on today. We live in the world where the Middle East continues to dominate headlines, continues to be the source of much of terror and upheaval in the entire world. And we're dealing with sheikhs, which is the name for Arab leaders. In each country, they have different roles. So it becomes glaringly, jumps out at you, the parallels of what was happening then and what's happening today. And that's why I chose to talk about this, because it's so relevant to what we see going on in the world today, which is creating a tremendous unrest in Israel for sure. But now we know it's not just Israel. events that have happened even in the United States and of course in Europe and everywhere in the world. We live in this uncertain state of which is still, frankly, completely out of control, and we don't know where the next curveball will come from, and God should protect us all, that which shouldn't come at all. But in a natural way, we are living in very volatile times. So I thought it very fascinating that the Torah, thousands of years ago, would actually open up a chapter about Sinai and begin with the Sheik of Midian, of basically modern-day Arabia, Saudi Arabia. How do you pronounce it, Sheik or Sheik? I think Sheik.
Most of us say Sheik.
Sheik, okay. I just don't want to say something for posterity and later say I mispronounced it. So,
most journalists say Sheik. Professional journalists would say Sheik.
Okay, there you go. What do unprofessional journalists say? Because I already had enough with professionals. As they say, professionals build the Titanic. The amateur build the Ark. So you got to be careful with professionals. Anyway, so with that said, I just think it jumps out at us. And when you start studying the message a little further, you realize some really very profound ideas. Whenever one of the wise things that one should always do whenever they're dealing with any situation, especially with one that is overwhelming upheaval, both personally and collectively for that matter, is one of the things that become very difficult when you're in a state of crisis or a state of shock even, or trauma or danger. It's very difficult to make rational decisions because we're overwhelmed by the circumstances. The classic example, and I don't like negative examples, but just to make the point, when someone is drowning in the water, they are very dangerous because if you send a lifeguard to save them, they are so desperate they don't even realize that their savior is coming to save them, so they'll pull down a lifeguard with them. If you're not trained how to deal with a drowning victim, you both can end up dying, because when you're in that state, your emotions take over. We begin to panic, and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting that drowning, of course, is a very direct, dangerous situation, but the same thing is in any type of emotionally fraught situation where one's judgment is being compromised and vision is being clouded. It's very hard to make decisions in the middle of a crisis. It's one thing you make it beforehand, you plan ahead. But once the storm strikes, it's very difficult to just pull yourself and say, you know what, let me figure out what to do, because now you're part of the whole situation and you're being dragged in. Especially when we include into the equation our subjectivity just adds to even more bad judgment calls and so on. So one of the key things to remember is to know exactly that when one is in a situation of that sort, of any type of crisis situation or upheaval or confused state even, a confused state is also fits the bill. It's very critical to get either objective opinion, which really ultimately and even more importantly is to get a bird's eye view, because upheavals from close up look terrible, look impossible to overcome. When you're in the middle of a storm, it's very hard for you to step back and say, this is just a little part of the picture, because you're in it. That's what myopic vision does. It only allows you to see the ground level. You cannot see the forest for the trees. So you see the tree, you see your immediate issue. So then, more than ever, that's when it's important to have a bird's eye view, to step back or to step up and get more of a panorama of the bigger picture. And then suddenly, when you look at it from that perspective, what may seem like an upheaval, when you look at it with all the frames of the film, you see the upheaval is actually a stepping stone toward greater revelation. So if someone were to, for example, magnify the cracking of an egg as a chick comes out of the preparing the ground for the chick to come out of the egg, and you didn't see the chick, you think, hey, what unbelievable. What's going on? It's destruction. Here there's an intact egg, protecting whatever is inside of it. Now it's starting to crack open. And if you didn't wait around to see the next frame, you'd think this crack is really a bad scenario. Then you come to realize, 1 second, one reality is being cracked in order to be a metamorphosis for another reality of a chick, of a bird, of a chicken, or whatever it may be, emerging. Same thing is in any given situation. When you're right in the middle of a transition, the transition can look very, very bloody, very, very disturbing if you don't see before and after. You only see that moment. If you step back, you realize it's part of a bigger picture. And that's true with all upheavals, which in a way is a way how the Jews really survived our greatest challenges, even the Holocaust. Of course, being in Egypt was, even though many did not survive, unfortunately, because that was not our choice, but how did the people who did survive after seeing that? Because they always knew it's not the entire story. There was always more to the story. When Abraham, in the Bible, in Lech Lecha, at the end, by Bris Ben Absarim, the covenant God makes with him, and God says to him that your children will be in a land that is not theirs, and they will be oppressed. And this, of course, causes Abraham to fall into a shudder in a dark state where he realized how difficult it would be for his children. And then God says and consoles him, and afterwards they will leave b'rechush gadol, with great treasure. So that somewhat calmed him down. In other words, it's not just the negative, it will lead to greatness. Now, here's not the place, this is not the topic this evening to discuss why we have to go through darkness to get to greater light. But that seems to be the story of life, that to change one reality, you have to somewhat shed one layer to assume a new layer, and that always has a certain element of pain, an element of loss. But the key is to keep your eyes on the ball and keep your eyes on the bigger picture. They say when Mashiach comes, Oitcha Hashem ki anafta bi. We will thank God for oppressing us. It's a very strange statement. What does that mean? Because we will then see that the oppression is not the end of the story. It's part of a bigger picture. And as soon as you know it's a part of a bigger picture, we can tolerate the birth pangs and the momentary pain because we know what it's giving birth to. As I said, I'm not getting down to the discussion why it has to be that way, but that's how it is. So when you look at a situation like we're in today, for example, in many ways we live in greatly blessed times. We don't have the challenges, anything close to what our grandparents did, both in the areas of financial comfort, political freedoms, religious freedoms. Yet we also have our upheavals and we have our uncertainties, including the uncertainty and the apathy that comes from, and complacency that comes from comfort zones. But we also have this looming, haunting threat that is coming, as I said, originates in the Middle East, and it doesn't see any we don't see any type of cessation of these challenges. Europe is under the specter of it. Israel, as I said, of course, and even the United States keeps on popping up. And we all know that we have not, let's put it this way, put out the fire. Just we thank God that it's not affecting us on a daily basis, and God should protect, again, every one of us everywhere, in Israel especially. But the fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, especially lately since the latest intifada, or whatever you want to call it, it's created a certain climate of tension. As strong as Israelis are, and as much as they want to continue living their life, how could you not go outside and look over your shoulder? You don't know who's who, because amidst you anyone can be wielding a knife. Yeah. So we're dealing in a situation, and this is not meant, I'm not suggesting trying to create more fright than necessary, but I'm trying to just depict the reality. It's an observation. So one of the ways to deal with it from a Jewish point of view, which really is universal for everyone, is to look at that bird's eye view. That's why it's so powerful to go back into the Torah, and you start seeing that these scripts have been written. That doesn't mean there isn't danger today, but it means that there's a way to have a deeper understanding of the events in our times when you have that bigger bird's eye view, as I mentioned, as well as having some direction where this is going. What should we be expecting? Because the worst part of it is not the actual, besides the actual upheaval and the actual uncertainty, is when you don't have a direction where to go with this, then what? You know, it's one thing you're fighting a war, but you know, if I do A, B, C, D, I can win the war and then live in peace forever. But if you don't even know a way how to fight the war, and you're not confident that you can win the war, and you don't know where it's going, that makes it far more complicated. You know, most of us would be able to endure almost anything if we knew there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And cynics like to say not that the light at the end of the tunnel is the lights of an oncoming train, of course. It means an actual light at the end of the tunnel. Because then at least you know, fine, I have to go through this, I'd rather not, but I know there's hope. I know there's a plan, there's a promise. In a sense, like the Jews knew, they would leave Egypt. They were promised, and they believed that promise, and was fulfilled. But when you don't seem to see a way out, then the troubles become far greater because you feel disempowered. And once you're powerless, then besides the problem, then you also don't feel, what do I do? And when you don't have a plan, we all know that when, let's say, whenever it's a difficult situation, but at least you have a plan, it already calms us because okay, fine, I have to go through this. Here's the plan. Let's start. But when you're in a situation where you get even more confused and you don't even have a plan, that's why it's so powerful. And I remember after September 11th, when we were going through it's the same extension, frankly, from then, but then it was very pronounced. The same thing I found personally, and I found many people, and I wrote about it a lot, and I saw the reaction that when you go into the Torah and you read the stories, and you realize this narrative didn't begin in the 20th century or the 21st century. It began back thousands of years ago, the battles in Abraham's tent between his two children, Isaac and Ishmael, who became the respective ancestors of the Jewish people and of the Ishmaelites, the Muslim-Arab world, the Arab-Muslim world. And then Isaac again battled between Esau and Jacob, the twins, again the ancestors and of the Roman Christian Western world, and the ancestor of the Jewish world. And you start seeing the parallels, and then you start realizing there's a story behind the story. Again, this doesn't take away from the immediate problem, but it's a very different way of looking at it when you have that perspective. So I want to suggest, as we read this chapter, that we can do exactly the same thing. We can find that type of approach and insight when we look at this chapter. And based on the initial question that I asked, which is, why does it begin with a sheik? As the professionals say, and as the amateurs would say, sheik maybe, I don't know. And how about spelling? S-H-E-I-K or S-H-E-I-K-H? I found those two spellings as well. Any thoughts on that?
With an H, yeah.
At the end?
An H at the end.
Okay, but it's also spelled the other way, so.
It's pronounced with an H at the end, Sheik.
Okay, good. Well, regardless, so when the chapter begins with that, and it's all happening in the Middle East, in the Sinai Peninsula, the Sinai Desert, and then of course Midian is the other side of Sinai, which is on the other side of the waters, which is, I think it's called the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, if I recall correctly. So it becomes very, as I said, it's glaring that there's something here. And all leading to, so let's start with the question, why is it important to have the Jethro's arrival to greet his son-in-law and the advice that he gives that we read about? Why is that so critical right before the revelation at Sinai? It seems somewhat of almost like a parenthetical. The Jews had left Egypt, okay. So then the Egyptians started pursuing them. They came to the river, the Red Sea, and the Red Sea split, parted before them. The Egyptians drowned, and now they were on to Mount Sinai. That's the next chapter. I mean, with a few things, the bread from heaven, the attack of Amalek, fine, it's all part of the story. But Jethro's arrival, how does that suddenly fit in here? Why do we need to hear about that? That his father-in-law came with Zipporah, with Moses' wife, and his two children, Elazar and Gershon and Elazar, and he gives advice. He sees Moses is overwhelmed by all the people coming to him for advice. And he says, why do you have to do it this way? Why don't you delegate? And Moses follows his advice, delegates, and that's where he creates the concept of delegation. Sorry, I love him. Sorry, Meis. Having someone, that will deal with 1,000 people, someone will deal with 100 people, someone will deal with 10 people, and then basically a hierarchy. And then that episode ends, and then we return to the story of Sinai. So seemingly the first half of this week's chapter is out of place, or at least not necessary in the context. So of course the commentaries, the Medrash, they all touch upon this because it's impossible to ignore. It's not like middle of nowhere. And as I mentioned, the whole chapter is not even called Matan Torah. It's called Jethro. Why would it be called that? It's not called Moses, it's called Yisro. Okay. So as we've discussed many times, when you start looking into the commentaries and the Midrashim and also into the Hebrew words, you begin to derive the answer. So what about the name Yisro itself? Since it's called Yisro, maybe we should look at that name. What does Yisro mean? So the Talmud says, as the Zohar as well, and the Medrash say Yisro comes from the word Yisroin, that he added something. In Hebrew, Yeser means to add, to increase. So his name was increasing something. And then we continue reading, that actually has 7 names. And each name has another dimension that tells us something about Yisro. So Yisro was not a simple person. He was a sheikh, but he was a sheikh, it says, like as Rashi and the commentaries say, he was a he was a great scholar. He was a man of the world, a global traveler, a global thinker, and as a person who mastered all the sciences of his time. And even not just the sciences, but also every form of philosophy, including all the forms of idolatry and paganism that existed. So he was considered to be the epitome of the scholar of that time in history. So that, of course, only begs the question more, how does that fit into this? The Torah was going to be given by God to the Jewish people for the entire human race as a blueprint for life. So Yisro seems to represent the antithesis to Torah. Because he was a scholar, not in Torah, he was a scholar in every other science and philosophy and so on. So the name Yisro is a key here because of the 7 names, that's of course the name we are most familiar with. Now Yisro also has another meaning, also as an addition, it comes as a verse in the book of Kehelet that says, King Solomon says, "V're'isi ani," and I have seen, and I see, Yisron ha'er min ha'cheshach, ki yisron ha'chochma min ha'sichlos, ki yisron ha'er min ha'cheshach. I see the advantage, Yisron, advantage, the superiority of wisdom over folly, which is comparable to the superiority and the dominance of light over darkness. An interesting statement. So equating light and darkness to folly, to wisdom and folly. Okay, what is the equation? So he says in Tanya chapter 12, very interesting statement. What's the comparison to light and dark? Light and dark are very interesting alter egos. As opposed, for example, to fire and water. Fire and water are 2 adversarial forces that are equal in power, meaning enough fire can evaporate large bodies of water, enough water can extinguish large amounts of fire. And they are therefore equals. And it depends who's going to dominate is going to be the one that's stronger, the one that's more quantity. Light and darkness do not work that way at all. When you have a little light, it dispels a lot of darkness, naturally and automatically without a struggle. So basically, really, darkness is just the absence of light. Fire is not the absence of water. Fire is a force in nature, and enough of it can challenge water. Darkness has no way to challenge light. You put dark and light together, they're not going to extinguish one another. Light will always dispel darkness. If it's a lot of darkness, a large dark room, obviously you need more light. But the area where light enters, it automatically dispels. So what King Solomon is saying is a brilliant insight, telling us the same as with wisdom and foolishness. A fool is no match for a wise person, because foolishness is not like fire and water. Foolishness is simply the absence of wisdom. So as soon as there's wisdom, you're going to dominate over a fool. And a fool wouldn't even know the difference, because that's what wisdom is about. Now, let me just qualify in case to make sure I'm saying the right thing here. This doesn't mean a fool with a knife obviously can be more powerful than a wise person without one. Just like a fool presses a button, or they say one fool can burn down a palace that 1,000 wise people build. That's not the point. That's simply because they have power. But I'm talking about the power of foolishness doesn't have power over wisdom, just like darkness doesn't have power over light. So when we behave foolishly or we behave in a way that is irrational, it's simply an absence of wisdom, which gives us a far more fighting chance. All you have to do is illuminate and teach an ignorant person, and that's the best way to resolve foolishness. Again, I understand a foolish person who wields power can be very dangerous. That's not what I'm just suggesting, however, that foolishness is not per se a force that's more powerful than intelligence. How is that relevant? So the Tanya explains it in the context of the divine soul and the animal soul, meaning that we have 2 voices within us. We'll call one the impulsive emotional voice, and the other one is the reflective cognitive voice. So your emotions are impulsive. You see something, you hear something, you taste something, someone manipulates you, someone convinces you, seduces you. So your emotions can get the better of you, and you'll do something not foolish. The wisdom is the sound reflective voice that says, before we move, before we act impulsively, let's think this through. Now, of course, most mistakes happen because we don't think it through, because the impulse gets the better of us, and by the time you're ready to think it through, you already made the mistake. How often, for example, do we react to someone insulting us and then you say, oh, I should have thought about it? How many mistakes? So most mistakes happen because of impulsive behavior. If you slept over it, you slept on it, and then you woke up in the morning and you thought about it, and once you get over that moment of passion or that moment of anger or that momentary need to react, usually you can deal with many things. So this is how he explains it. So in that context, Yisrei then comes from the word of this advantage. Advantage what? From darkness, the advantage of light over darkness. But it goes further. Hasidic thought explains, based on this concept, that there's a deeper message in the advantage of light over darkness. It's not just that light is more powerful than darkness. If you read the verse closely, Yisr na'er min ha'cheshach, which has another meaning, that if you want to see the power of light, you see it from darkness. You can't appreciate light unless you've been in darkness. I mean, you could appreciate it, but you can't appreciate it as much. Anyone who's been deprived of something appreciates much more that which, when they get it, than someone who's never been deprived. If you have a sense of entitlement, or you've never tasted the opposite, then you take for granted. You know, most of us see light as a given. But if you've been in a dark state, I'm talking now emotionally, psychologically, you appreciate clarity and light a lot more. So in a sense, what it really means is that from darkness, we come to a deeper appreciation of light. And finally, there's even a deeper interpretation of that itself. Not just the human being, come to deeper impression, it's actually a deeper form of light that emerges from the darkness. So you have the idea that darkness that's transformed to light is more powerful than light that is originally light. So it's actually not just that you appreciate it more, it's actually indeed more powerful. So many examples can be given for this. For example, when you take this scenario where a person who has been was vulnerable and been hurt in their lives, and then they built up strength, their strength will always be stronger than someone who's never been hurt in the first place. Now, we'd prefer not to have to go through that, but once you do, there's a certain immunity. Listen, the fact of the matter, look at the common cold. Why is it that once you have one cold, you never get the same strain? Because once you build up immunity, that's it. So there's a certain element of protection that happens when we've gone through the fire and we've come out. They say, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So in that sense, Yisr na'er min ha'cheshach, then therefore, the dark. So now we go back now to the story of this Sheik of Midian, called Yisrei. His power of Yisrei taught something that no one, even Moses, could not teach us, and that's why it was necessary to have him come first. And what's the story? It goes like this. Matan Torah, the revelation at Sinai was, as I said, not a small event. And it wasn't an event only for that moment. And it wasn't an event only for Jews. Matan Torah, as explained in Sinai, as explained in many of the Talmudic and Midrashic, and especially the mystical teachings, the Hasidic teachings, it changed the universe forever. And its impact would have become perpetual and really set the stage for a world, what we call a world of true peace, a messianic world. So let me explain what that means. You could say, one second, Matan Torah was Sachaka. What was it? God formally gave his book of laws to the people. What's so dramatic about that? But it goes a lot deeper than that. He did not give this book, even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were great men, and much greater than us, he did not give it to them formally, though they did keep it informally. So what exactly happened at Sinai, and why is it such a critical event? So the Medrash, the Talmud, the Medrash says, and I've quoted this a number of times, and let's use Einstein's E equals mc squared as a point of reference, that one of the things Einstein taught us is that energy and matter are reversible. And everybody says, wow, that's a tremendous insight. And he actually developed formulas to demonstrate it. But the truth is, Einstein, as a Jew, was preceded by the concept by Sinai. That's exactly what Sinai came to do. The Medrash puts it this way, that before Sinai there was a breach, there was a schism, you can say there was a dissonance between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, between energy and matter. The word the Medrash says, that which belonged above stayed above, that which was below stayed below. And Sinai bridged the two, is the first interface in existence. The interface between body and soul, between matter and spirit, between form and function, between matter and energy. That was the achievement. In simple words, it meant that until Sinai, if you did a good deed, you did a good deed, but you didn't change reality. By Sinai, we were able to actually take the material world and refine it and turn it into a spiritual agent, into a channel for spiritual energy. Essentially, in scientific terms, that's matter and energy. In so-called more Torah-like terms, it would be spirit and matter and spirit. So, we take, for example, a piece of wax and a wick, which for all practical purposes is just a mundane part of this world. You light a flame, you make a blessing Friday before sundown, and you say that this is Neresh Shabbos Kodesh. These are the holy flames of Shabbat. You've taken a mundane, neutral part of this mundane material universe and you've turned it into holy light. So the bottom line is, as he explains in a number of places, that the purpose of existence is for us to take the material world and turn it into a divine home. Now the material world is a hostile world. Hostile to itself, hostile to each other, hostile to anything that's divine. What does the material world declare? I and nothing else. It's all about ego, self-interest. So for us to be able to take a world like this, which is driven by the rules of materialism, which are what? That everything occupies time and space, and what exists in one space cannot allow room for another entity to be in that space. You're sitting in your chair, no one else can go into your chair. No, that we can do is bring love into the world, and love transcends time and space. That we can take a material world and turn it against itself, that instead of being a selfish, in the words of Richard Dawkins, a selfish gene that all cares about is his own survival, that we learn to care about each other. We learn to take a material world and turn it into a home of the divine. What was the Mishkan? The building of the sanctuary right after Sinai? It was the consummation of what Sinai taught. Sinai taught there is no the dissonance between matter and spirit. The Mishkan said, here's how, take gold, silver, copper. Not a spiritual sanctuary. Not a sanctuary in your mind or in your heart. But in the physical world, take physical items. The epitome of those, of course, is charity. You take money, which is the epitome of selfishness. The epitome, what people define as being my value. And you turn it into something sacred. That is the purpose of existence. And Sinai introduced that type of energy into the existence, as the way the Hasidic masters put it, that from a place that's higher than spirit and matter, a third dimension came and said, now you can interface spirit and matter. We don't have two worlds. Now there are people who will argue there's duality. They'll say the expression, Shemayim Lashem, heaven belongs to God, and the land was given to the people. What are you trying to bridge two worlds like this? We are material human beings and live in your material world. No, Judaism teaches there's no such dichotomy. Hashem Echad, there's one reality, a divine reality, the divine reality of a higher presence in a material world. So though initially it seems contradictory because we look at the material world, it seems antithetical to anything that is giving. It's a world that takes. That's exactly the purpose when God created the world. Take a world of takers and turn them into givers. So it's not an easy thing to achieve, but it's a tremendous achievement, and it's called Dira B'Tachtenim, to make a home for the divine in this lowest of worlds. So Matan Torah opened the door, opened the channel for bringing those two worlds together. So it's much more than a book of laws and God giving the Torah. A new power entered into existence that would change the universe forever, which allows us today to be able to unite these two realities in our own lives, our bodies and our souls. Because some people could argue, you know what? You want to be spiritual, but it has nothing to do with your eating and sleeping and making a living and doing your physical activities. And the Torah says no. You take your physical activities and you sanctify even the physical. We do not just sanctify the spiritual, we sanctify the physical, both in time, in space, objects. What is a Torah scroll? What is a mezuzah? What is tefillin? You take animal hide, you turn it into leather, and you turn it into parchment, I should say, and then you write holy letters on it, and it becomes a holy Torah scroll. something that was a moment before animal hide. And the same thing with everything in this world. We tame the elements and we transform a material world into becoming a divine home. On a very basic level, our own personal homes. It's made of bricks and mortar, stone, wood, whatever it is, a beautiful home. You don't just have a home for shelter, a home just where to eat your meals or where you sleep and where you protect your young, but it becomes a sacred home. Your table becomes an altar. You study Torah on it. It's a home that invites guests into it. There's a spirit to the home. The home is not just a shelter, it's a divine home. A house filled with light, a house filled with many holy books, a house filled with mezuzah, which is the scrolls that we put, what do we call mezuzah in English? A mezuzah is a mezuzah, okay.
A marriage, if that's possible.
Okay, so that's why Matan Torah is called a marriage, the marriage between heaven and earth. Yom Chasanose Zeh Matan Torah. Why is it a marriage? Because a marriage is not just a contract. A marriage is a union of two opposites. In this case, the divine met the mundane. So when people ask the question, where does heaven kiss earth? It happened at Mount Sinai. That's where the first kiss took place, the first embrace, and that opened up the door for a new reality. But of course, the work is now up to us. So using modern lingo, interface, fusion, these are Matan Torah terms. Matan Torah, Sinai created that. So when you want to create that type of fusion, how could you do that? If Moses himself was the only one that initiated it, one could argue, you know what, Moses didn't represent the material world. Moses was a holy man. That's where Yisrei, enter Yisrei. You need to have someone that represents the material world. Someone who's a wise man in the sciences, in the paganism of the time, in the idolatry. And he comes and says, you know something? Your God is greater than all the gods I know, as he puts it. So that's Yisrael Menachesha. Because if Moses said Torah is great and God is great, of course he says that. There's no alternative. When a Yisrael comes, a man of the world, and he comes and says, now I see the greatness of what you are experiencing and what you've gone through, it's so-called an endorsement and a credibility that comes from the bottom up. And that's a prerequisite and necessary for Matan Torah to achieve its thing, because it's a credibility. It's like they say the difference between advertising and PR. Advertising, you pay for ads, so you're paying for it. PR is when the media endorse you, even though you may be paying behind the scenes. We're not going to get into that. But at least from the perception of the outsider, it seems like it's been endorsed by them. It's a credibility. And if it's a true endorsement, a true testimonial, that means that someone who's not your brother or sister or partner or investor says is good. We all know the power of that. Because then there's a truth that's a resonating element. You know, as an author of a book, I can tell you, I remember the publisher said, when asked, what's the sign of a successful book? So everyone answers, selling millions of copies. No publisher will ever answer that. That may make you money, quick money, but that's not really the successful book. Is a book that the people who read it continue to read it and continue to refer to it and refer others, and they'll give it as a gift. Then it has a perpetuity to it. You know, you read a book and you put it and you never show it to anyone, you never share it to anyone. So you may have been entertained and it may have sold millions for that moment, but a book that you give to someone and you say, read this book, it's touched me, that's an endorsement that's impossible to buy, because that means that people coming from their perspective see the value. The author of the book or the friends of the author, of course they like the book. They're subjective. So in a way, Yisrei was the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate objective party that actually could have been seen as a person who was actually hostile to all of this. As you may know, Yisrei was one of the three advisors to Pharaoh. There were three advisors, Bilam, Yisrei, and Ehuv. But nevertheless, Yisrei come. That's why his name Yisrei, that he added a chapter in the Torah. He added something that no one else could add, because he had that credibility. And somewhat similar to, you hear sometimes the idea that there are two types of personalities in Jewish thought. There's the tzaddik and there's the Baal Tshuva. The tzaddik is a righteous person. Adam Yashar Heilach, person who's always traveled on the straight path and never wavered. Okay, that's great, a righteous man or woman. But then there's a Baal Tshuva. A Baal Tshuva means a master of return, to be precise in the words. What return means? It means he's wavered, he's wandered off the road and experienced all kinds of things. that were not necessarily appropriate. And then he finds his way back. So it says, "B'mokim shebal tshuva emdim, tzadikim gemurim lo emdim sham, einam emdim sham." A place where a Baal Tshuva stands, the righteous can never stand. Then some places it says, the Rambam, Maimonides adds, einim yechelim lamed. Not only they don't stand there, they can't stand there. Why? Because they never went through the fire. So for all their righteousness, which is great, and they have plenty of virtues, they've never tasted from the forbidden fruit, so they never can demonstrate the truth that comes from darkness. And one that has been thirsty will teach you about water a lot more than someone who's never been thirsty. And that's just an analogy. That analogy applies to so many other scenarios. So Yisro represented that. So it wasn't some type of footnote. It happened to be someone who lived in the outside world, so to speak, in the secular world, and comes to recognize that this prepared the ground, that now Sinai can happen. Now, of course, this came after 210 years of the Jews in Egypt, which was also the similar idea. Why do they have to go through that? Because the oppression leads you to greatness. A people that has not suffered, a people that have not paid the price, will not always appreciate the gifts you give them. They appreciated it because they came through darkness. But Yisro was like the final seal, that a man like that, who was a chacham, a wise scholar, the wisest of his time. I don't know if you know this, but I think that the Druze, not the Jews, the D-R-U-Z-E, see Yisro as their ancestor, as their main prophet, and as their spiritual leader. They see him as the... So...
They serve in the Israeli army.
Yeah. Well, the Jews in Israel are very pro-Israel. The Jews out of Israel are anti-Israel. That's how it goes. But bottom line is, so Yisro was not a small matter. Now let's apply this now to our times. And here's where it gets, I think, very fascinating. So you have now a situation where, as I said, no longer like it was in Abraham's times, where there was one Yishmael, one Isaac, one Esav, one Jacob. Now all of them have built nations, empires. As the Torah predicts, actually, when Jacob and Esav are struggling as twins in Rebekah's womb, and she complains and says, "Why is my pregnancy so difficult?" So God responds, "Because you have within you two nations. Ulum yemotz. Two nations are struggling within you. And when one rises, the other will fall." Now, some attribute these two as being Christianity and Judaism. You could also interpret a little bit. The Greeks are Judaism, but the Jews. But regardless, it represents two archetypes that are at each other's throats, both in that time and throughout history. It's one of the most amazing predictions in the Torah that actually was fulfilled in the fullest sense of the word. Look how much Jews have suffered at the hands of the Christians throughout the centuries. And then comes into the equation the third character, Yishmael, which now we hear a lot more troubles from that sector than from the Christian world. But Yishmael is doing today, and I'm not saying all Muslims are terrorists, but they say all terrorists are Muslims. That's interesting. So what's happening today with Muslim extremism is essentially what the Christians were doing up till around the 18th, 19th century. And I pointed this out a number of times. I'm convinced that the Muslim world is more or less where the Christians were a few hundred years ago. But now everything will accelerate because we live in faster times. But that was what was going on. The Christian world felt the way to dominate was through terrorism, through dominance, through subordination, and the real subjugation is a better word, of literally killing the enemy by the sword. This was the Crusaders that marched through the Middle Ages, the Inquisition in its form and fashion, the pogroms in theirs, even the Holocaust in its own way. Even though it wasn't per se a religious war, the Holocaust, but as many have argued, including Zev Berkovitz in his Faith After the Holocaust, that the Holocaust would not have been possible without the Christian persecution and anti-Semitism that prevailed in Europe. Yeah. So bottom line is that religious forces, it's very true, have brought a lot of terror to this world. And of course, Jews have always been at the brunt, in all senses of the word. Israel, of course, is always at the center of activity. So when you think of it that way, how do you apply these ideas? So what you get down to is that we have now nations of billions of people that embrace these ideas. So we could see it from a Jewish perspective. You know what? Maybe we won't announce it, we won't advertise it, but the Christians, the hell with them, what they did to us. The Muslims, the hell with them, what they're doing to us. And we have to just preserve our own lives and just try to avoid them. But that's not how Jews think. The Jews never thought that way. It's not just about insulating ourselves and protecting our skin. We always saw that we were responsible for the whole world. Because remember, Abraham gave birth to Yishmael and to Isaac. Isaac gave birth to Esau and to Jacob. So these are our family. The world is our family, and even when they behave in ways that they kill us, we still carry a certain responsibility. I know it can sound quite bizarre. We carry responsibility for the Nazis. So obviously we don't carry responsibility. They did what they did, and we're not blamed for it. But in a certain sense, we think in terms of human race is not behaving the way it should behave. The Jewish people look at it as God's mandate is not being fulfilled in this world, and what can we do about it? That's how a real Jew thinks. That's how Abraham thought. Now, as an aside, it's not really a footnote, but I should qualify it because you'll say, one second, most of the rabbis and synagogues I know don't talk this way at all. What do they talk? They're all about insulation and being very parochial. It's true. After 2,000 years of playing defense and having to protect ourselves, Judaism has turned inward, has turned very defensive, has turned very much insular and parochial. Let's just protect ourselves because the world out there is our enemy. And that's why you'll find, even till this day, when a Jew gets too prominent, like Lieberman trying to run for vice president, you have a whole segment of Jews who come yelling and screaming, it's no good for the Jews, don't make so much noise. Don't get their attention, who knows when they'll turn on us. This is a silent, quiet, not so quiet always, but many, many, many Jews think this way. I don't know where you stand. And it's understandable, because whenever we thought we let our guard down, look what happened. The golden age of Spain. Germany, for many years, was very hospitable, and Jews thrived there. And look what happened. So many people feel that's the way we should be. However, there's one major problem. Abraham was not this way, and neither was Moses, and neither the great pioneers. Judaism never began as a parochial system. Abraham, Megayos Anoshim, who touched everybody, as did his wife Sarah. Now, Judaism was never a proselytizing religion, not trying to convert anybody, but teaching people the Word of God, teaching people ethics, morals, was always a Jewish thing, a light unto nations. Maimonides, citing the Talmud, says that an obligation of a Jew is not just to reach the Jews, but also to teach the non-Jewish world about the laws, the 7 Noahide laws, which are really more than 7. People dismiss them as 7. They happen to be most of the 10 Commandments. So they happen to be. If every Jew kept the 7 Noahide laws, we'd have Mashiach here already, just for the record. So they're not such small little footnotes. And they actually break down into many more than 7, into 90, whatever the number is. Which means to teach the world ethics. So when the United States of America, its founding fathers built this country on principles of the Torah, that's the epitome of Judaism affecting the entire world. Now you don't have to become Jewish. Just live a moral, ethical life. That's what God wants of us. And that's what we have an obligation to teach them. Maimonides writes this at the end of the 8th chapter in his Laws of Kings, Malachim. He says that responsibility to influence, to inspire the entire world. Now, the fact that we have become insular and protective, that's a sad consequence and byproduct of Golos. But that doesn't mean that's where it's supposed to be. Kimitzion Seitzei Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. From Zion will come Torah and the word of God from Jerusalem. This will be a house of prayer to all nations. Which house? The Holy Temple. Not just for Jews. The Medrash says that if the non-Jewish world knew how much protection and blessings they received from the Holy Temple, instead of destroying it, they would have surrounded it with legions to protect it, because they knew it's the source of blessing to them. And unconsciously, the non-Jewish world knows this. As it says in Lech Lecha, V'vrachem v'vrachachecha, those that will bless you will be blessed. And you find this throughout history, that people, even though they may not like Jews, but they want Jews' blessings. And they know there's a blessing there somewhere. So with that said, let's go back now to how we look at the world today. So Maimonides says something else which is even more radical. It was actually censored out of some of the editions of Maimonides due to the censorship, the Christian censorship. So the end of the Laws of Kings, he writes about Christianity and Islam. As I said, in many of the present-day editions, you don't find those lines, but we have them from earlier editions. And he talks about, obviously, he negates Jesus as being a Messiah for the reasons that he quotes, because he abrogated, did not fulfill the prophecies, and also abrogated Jewish law, etc., etc. He also talks about Muhammad, with the name that he calls him in there. But then he says something really, really, I would say, forward-thinking. And just to remember, this is Maimonides' writing in the 11th century. 11th century wasn't exactly a peaceful time. There were the battles going on between Christians and Muslims. Maimonides suffered as a result. He was in Spain, then in Egypt, and so on. And he writes the following, that with all Christian and Muslim problems, so to speak, the fact is, in God's mysterious ways that we will never understand, the fact that Christianity and Islam are spreading all over the world, they're bringing the Word of God to the farthest islands, the farthest outskirts of the world, and in some way, liyasher, they pave the way to Mashiach's coming, because they're introducing to the pagan larger masses ideas that are coming from the Torah. He's not suggesting, obviously, that Christianity and Islam are all accurate, or that it's for a Jew, but he's explaining, as a leader would explain, a visionary, that in some mysterious way God is using them as agents to bring the message to the entire world. And this was before there was no country yet like the United States. There was no Christian country that was benevolent yet. So for Maimonides to write that in the 11th century is quite, I would say, quite amazing, actually. Pretty radical for someone to write that. It would be like someone in the middle of Nazi Europe suddenly saying that, despite all that, European non-Jews are paving the way to the Messiah in some way. Now, he's not advocating, obviously, God forbid, anything negative that they did, but in some way they took a pagan world and made it a little godlier, with all its flaws and all its distortions and mistakes. This is a rare document, a rare statement. You rarely hear from anyone something so powerful, and he's not writing about Jews, he's writing about them. To write such a so-called, I don't call it endorsement, but essentially like understanding that God has a bigger plan. And now you see it with countries like the United States and other countries, with all the flaws of this country, and I'm not getting now into the presidential election and all that and these details, as we discussed before the class, and we know Daliel is deeply involved. I'm talking about the bigger picture, is that this country has become a haven. For Jews, we have to count our blessings in a country like this. Because the big picture, countries like this and other countries have allowed us to be as we are, and allowed all human beings to be free. Again, it's not a blanket endorsement that everything is working well. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that should not be taken for granted, because that did not exist before the 18th century. Okay? You go to the 16th century and prior, we lived under monarchs, under the church, under other despots, fascists, totalitarians, whatever you want to call them. Kings, monarchs, who controlled everything without any freedoms guaranteed. There was no such thing as a Bill of Rights. There was no such thing as freedom of your individual rights. So whatever you want to say, even as bad as you want to say the world is today, you cannot take away from the fact that we can sit here right now and no one's going to arrest us, and no one's trying to persecute us, and no one's killing us because we're practicing our religion or teaching or learning and so on. So it's very important to remember that, despite all the other stuff going on in the world. So how then do we look at what's happening now? So you could say, okay, as I said, the hell with all these sheikhs. We all know what many of them are saying, the imams in the mosques every Friday or in their speeches. We know they're instigating, we know they're inciting. So we understand, and we are not naive, and we have to put down our guard, and we have to be very well, make sure, lock your doors, and more than that, have an army and protect and prevent. And so we're not passive in the sense we turn the other cheek. This is not a Gandhi-like approach. We know they're real enemies, and real enemies have to be confronted and eradicated for that matter. That's a given. However, just like Maimonides saw the bigger picture, there's a bigger picture. The bigger picture is this, that with all the flaws of Islam, there's something that to be said for passion. And I want to make sure, I want to qualify this right, nobody gets this the wrong way. This is not in any way looking for a redeeming element in the ISIS or in the other terrorists that are beheading or burning or killing innocent people. There's absolutely nothing redeeming about that. But the fact of the matter is that there's misguided passion going on. Young people being impressed by these passionate ideas, again, misguided, and therefore that you cannot invalidate. You cannot invalidate young people looking for direction. So for us to just say there are a bunch of violent criminals and let's just kill them all, obviously when it comes to that, that's what you have to do. But the bigger picture is, can we turn these sheiks into a Yisrael? Can they perhaps be pressured, one way or another, I'm not sure how, we could talk about the methods, to instead of using their mouthpiece and their platforms for advocating hate and terror and murder, to maybe learn from the first sheikh of them all. Who was the first sheikh? Jethro. Also a sheikh, who also came from a pagan world and was a great wise man, and instead turned it for the positive, to appreciate what God really wants. And I've said this already after September 11th, that the real war, in my opinion, is not a war of weapons. We have to have weapons because we're dealing with killers. We're dealing with real threats. But the real war is an ideological one. It's taking place in the schools, in the mosques, in the classrooms of the Middle Eastern countries. Because who is teaching these children hate? Who's teaching them that Islam is the only religion that matters and everyone else is an infidel that needs to be killed? That's happening in classrooms. It's not happening just like that. That's happening in people who are in a position like Yisrael's, using their power and their educational and their persuasion and their influence. And I studied, after 9/11, the influences of bin Laden. Bin Laden was we're not talking about malcontents and social misfits and people who are angry at the system. You're talking about wealthy, well-educated, many of them, sophisticated, and yet they turn like this because their minds have been influenced by very passionate thinkers who called for this violence. I quote many times Qutb, Q-U-T-B. He was one of the godfathers, one of the Muslim fundamentalism, one of the great teachers of that, one of the masters. Bin Laden's teacher. He was actually executed by President Nasser of Egypt in 1968 because he was too threat. He wrote a 60-page volume commentary on the Quran. Read his documents and you'll see how compelling they are. They're chilling on one end, but they're compelling. They're compelling in the context that Islam has replaced Christianity, which has replaced Judaism as the chosen people on this earth to bring God's will to this world. And the Western world are infidels. They're decadent. They're into Hollywood, into sports, and in many ways he's saying the truth. When you look at the Western world, there's plenty of decadence, and there's plenty of godlessness, and so on. Now, who appointed him to decide, that's another story. And he calls for violence and a jihad and so on. So don't get me wrong, I'm not defending. I'm just saying that he's filling a vacuum of ideological, passionate need of young people to have a cause. So what does America offer our young people as a cause? A Super Bowl, the Oscars, good food, culture. Very nice. But it does not fill the void of that needed spiritual nourishment. So what's happening when there's a void? Who enters a void? All the pollutants. Where do you think bacteria gather? They gather where there's a void. You leave a void, and as we know, nature abhors a void, and so does the human spirit. So who's going to fill it? Whatever comes its way. If it's positive, great. If it's not. So that's how I see it. Not that I'm suggesting anything redeeming, but we have to learn from it. So to say, which is what the Western world mostly says, just leave us alone, stop killing us. We'll give you IBM, we'll give you computers, Apple, McDonald's, Oscars, some beauty pageants, and that's a TV. The Muslim world is offended when they hear that. Who are you? Are you going to give us your decadence? Now, trust me, they're plenty decadent too. Let's make this very clear. It's not like they're exactly most refined. We know what some of those people who blew the planes in September 11 did the night before, besides reading their holy texts. And they're waiting for the virgins in heaven, etc., etc. So, I'm not suggesting they're exactly refined, but there's still an element there that is passionate, very misguided. So we take a Yisrael, the first of all sheiks, and we learn lessons from it. That because to bring world peace, it's not enough just to have the Western leaders aboard. You need the Middle Eastern leaders aboard. We need Yisrael. the potential Yisraels, I should say, because they're not Yisrael exactly, but they could become. Because we cannot change the world without the Muslims, to be very straightforward. We're not going to kill 1.8 billion Muslims. That's not even, no one has that on their lap, and neither should they be killed. No one's suggesting they're all that way. There's a breeding ground there. And there's probably more support than we know for what's going on. Some just support it silently. Some say, I don't believe in murder, but I understand their cause. How many people do you hear that? I don't believe everyone should be stabbed, but I understand their frustration. You hear this all the time. So we have a battle that's far deeper than just a battle of weapons and a battle of don't kill us. You're dealing with real ideology. So you need a master of ideology like Yisrael was to turn and say, you know something? This is the way. Abraham, you want to go by Abraham's direction? Abraham prayed for infidels. Not that he supported them, but he prayed for them because he looked at ways of how you heal the world, not how you destroy the world. You want to bring spiritual passion to the Western world, the decadent Western world? Inspire the Western world. Why don't you figure out how to inspire? The call for killing, the call for intolerance, that's where the problem is. So we're in need of a sheik, basically, or a sheik, or sheik with an H at the end. A milkshake wouldn't hurt either, right? Yeah. So we're in need of a sheik. We need a sheik because if we want to bring that world peace fusion, that Matan Torah, that Sinai introduced to the world, we need Yisrael first. So when you look at the world, you want to look at the big picture, we have to look for the Yisrael in all of this. Now the question is how? So the first step is we have to talk about it. Because even what I'm saying, I know when I say, some people start, they raise their eyebrows. Wow, one second, I never heard something like that. That's like a different type of look. Because usually we just see them as killing us. They're just killers. And I agree, don't get me wrong. Again, weapon comes first when it comes to someone who's about to stab you. You're not going to sit and have a conversation and say, hey, by the way, before you stab me, let me tell you, God wants you to be a nice guy. I understand, but that's not what we're saying. But I'm talking now in the collective picture, the global picture of it. We have to understand where we're headed here. And frankly, when I read this and you hear it, it gives you hope. What do you mean hope? Not tomorrow, but we have hope. There's a plan. You could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Without this, yesterday I was interviewed by Arutz Chad, Station 1 in Israel. They're doing a 3-hour special on Rambam. So they interviewed me yesterday for a long interview. So I was asking them, what's the mood? These were secular Israelis. And it was very interesting how helpless they felt. Helpless was the word they used. Helpless. So I shared with them some of these ideas. So again, this doesn't mean it's going to be solved overnight, but at least you understand there's a bigger picture here. And you could fight for it. Now, we're going to need serious leaders to be able to fight. We cannot have firefighters and administrative assistants running the show, obviously. Because here you need visionaries. I can imagine vision. I don't know who, but imagine a visionary rising in Israel or in the United States and makes some statement of this nature and say, you know what? We are not going to forfeit and surrender the platform of morality to radical Islam. You want to talk about morality and God? I have something to say. There's a man called Abraham who taught us all the path of righteousness. And he was more passionate about God than about religion and more against decadence than anybody. And yet he taught us the path of peace. That's what we need someone saying. And putting pressure, financial pressure, political pressure, moral pressure on the leaders in the Arab and Muslim countries. And look for this sheikh. Quote Yisrael. We're looking for a Yisrael among you. You know what? And there's no doubt we have the power. There's clout. The United States has clout. It's not used it. And if it's using it, it's only using it in a very narrow, limited way. As we all know, the mess with Iran and other messes. But the bottom line is we have power, and there is a power. And if we went with this type of approach, it'd be a whole different type of, it's another, opening up another front. And this doesn't take away from other efforts. If military needs are necessary, we learn from Jacob. You prepare for war, you prepare a bribe to appease, and you pray. Thank God, Jacob was enough the bribe and the prayer. So I'm not suggesting we put down we eliminate the other options, but we have to broaden the playing field, the battlefield, I should say. That's a battlefield of ideas, and the battlefield of ideas is the one that's going to ultimately win here. There's no question. And unless you can give a young Muslim boy or girl a very good reason to be passionate in a different way than what they're being taught, you lost them. And frankly, the young people in our country who don't have any other passion except for video games and social media and boys and girls and sex and sports and so on, it's another tragedy that we have to give them a spiritual passion as well. That's where the final frontier is. And Yisro teaches us a tremendous lesson in this, how specifically and explicitly a person that was not from the fold, so to speak, someone who came from the outside world, someone who was a scholar and all that I mentioned, should come and acknowledge and should come and add something and teach us from the darkness the greatest light emerges. So we have great darkness today, yes, on that level, but great light can emerge from it. It's not there yet, but we have to demand it, and the more we understand it, the more we share it with others, that's the ripple effect. I could see this becoming a viral message online where people say, here's a way, here's a message, but we have to do our part, and if we do so, I have no doubt, as Jews can testify, we've seen the abyss many times. Things have been a lot worse than what we see today, and we made it. Chol dar v'dar, oindem aleinu l'chalaseinu. In every generation, they rose to annihilate us. In this case, it's not just us; it's also the non-Jewish world is being threatened. And yet, because of our faith, Hisha Amdalan, the faith that we have, the promise, the bigger picture, the bird's eye view, that's what sustains us. Because we don't give up, because we know there's more to the story than what we see. So we have to be wise, we have to be proactive, we have to teach, and we have to be a light unto nations. So Yisro, we thank Yisro for being a role model that we need today. If it was just a Jewish scholar, the Arab world would say, hey, we're not interested in your Jewish scholars. We present them a sheik. Here's our sheik. The sheik of the century, the sheik of the millennium. What am I talking about? He gets the first prize. Here's the sheik you should all be looking up to.
Wouldn't Sadat get second prize?
Sadat?
Who came to Israel?
Well, he's in heaven, or wherever he is. I don't know if he'd get second prize exactly. Sadat is mixed. The jury's out. Remember, he also led the Yom Kippur War. When he couldn't do it by war, he did it smarter. He did it through that. I don't know if Sadat would go up there. I'm not sure. I have to look around. There are actually some imams, they have a little courage to come out, to be honest. But you know what? We're not ready to give out prizes. First, let the competition first, let them compete for it. Let them prove themselves. So we're not awarding awards yet. Yeah, we'll award awards the day before Mashiach comes, or when we see that the world is changing, So anyway, so we have Yisro to present to them. One of yours, look at him, look what he did. And as a result, because of him, a Torah was given to this world that changed the world. So he was a sheikh actually that preceded the Muslim world and the Christian world. So God should bless that. We should all be wise enough to understand that we have a situation now that has the opportunity to lead us to a truly new revolutionary, we call spiritual revolution of a higher awareness and spiritual consciousness. It's called the Messianic Age, and we are on that threshold, which of course explains the Medrash that my Rebbe, our Rebbe, mentor, Rabbi Schneerson, cited a number of times, which literally makes the case as follows. He spoke about it, but during the first Persian Gulf War, what happened when Saddam Hussein, what did he do? He moved into Kuwait. Remember that? And the whole world went crazy. That was like one of the first insurgencies that happened that began the upheaval. Some say that was like the first step of what would lead to the Arab Spring and then the Arab Winter and frost that we're now experiencing. So there's a medrash in Yalkut Shmeini that the Rebbe cited that says that when a melech paras, a Persian king, will attack an Arab country, and the whole world will rise up and say, we're terrified. What will happen? What's happening? And then the Jewish people will start crying out, what's happening? What's happening? And God will say, my children, don't be afraid. I do all this for you. Higiaz mangul aschem, the time of your redemption has arrived. That's the big picture. So we're seeing upheavals. No one's denying that there are wars, and we're not denying that there are challenges. It's not like we're naive and say, oh, you know what, we know we have to deal with the reality on the ground, but remember the bigger picture. The time of your redemption has arrived. And we're now in a state of that final upheaval. That's like that crack in the egg that doesn't feel good and does not look good, but it's a crack that will open up a window to a whole new reality. But we have to do our part, and we have to look for those sheiks. That's a good look for the sheiks. whether it's milkshakes or the shaky, what is the shake, rattle, and roll, a type of dance. And then there's the real shakes of Midian and Yisrael, and the ones we're looking for in the Middle East. And God should bless that we should, before even all is achieved, should actually be the Geula, the Mitzvah Vashlema, the actual redemption. And with that said, this has been Simon Jacobson, Wednesday Night Live. Till next Wednesday, 8:15, 8:30ish. And if you haven't left your email address, please do so. And I hope I did justice to this important topic. And hopefully you can do something with it yourselves and carry it on and perpetuate it, like a domino effect, a ripple effect. And hopefully we can all be wiser and, more importantly, have some direction and guidance and strength in getting through this challenging time. Thank you very much. Sure.
You talk about the void and toxic blaring in the world. Why'd you say pollutants fill the void? Why not goodness and a thirst for something better?
I wish it was that way. Pollutants don't have to fill it, but pollutants can fill it. What happens usually is when the immunity, like when you in a surgical room, you need to have very high,
Sterility.
Right. Because when there's exposure of and you don't have the proper defenses, the bacteria come running. Obviously, if you fill it with positive energy, that prevents it from happening. But the first things that come to feed off the vacuum is usually going to be negative energy. That's how it usually happens. Unless you do something, that's my point.
So I remember from many of your classes I used to take on the West Side, I just want to refresh myself. How could each of us as individuals help fill that void ourselves? Is it just by following the Ten Commandments or following the...
Okay, very good question. I didn't answer that. Look, we believe in the microcosm, macrocosm.
Yeah.
We each have the Sheik inside of us.
Okay.
We each have the radical voice. We have the nonsense. So I think in a microcosmic level...
The confusion and the fear.
Yeah, and we take on the microcosmic level when we have our animal soul
Yeah.
acknowledges God. It's a way like Yisrael acknowledging the divine. So I think the microcosm
We
in
try
us...
to bring God into our homes and
Yes,
into our lives.
exactly. And become less divisive and less fearful and less negative. That's on the microcosmic level, and that has its ripple effect. Good question. Thank you.
Whatever we can do to be a light unto others also.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And if you have a friend or two that are actual sheiks, go out with a coffee with them, have a coffee, and read and tell them the story of the first sheik. That's it. Maybe that's a good name for a film, The First Sheik.
Wow.
Huh? Okay, thank you again.